Alright, so here we go. This is our next video segment here, and hopefully if there's one of you doing homework, this is what I call the Old South. Now, I broke this into 3 sections. The first section is going to take us from the Dred Scott decision all the way to the end of Reconstruction. So first off, what makes a man? Dred Scott was a former slave, and he ran away, got all the way to Missouri, and then ultimately they decided, well, is he a man? Is he a slave? And what they basically came up with is that slaves were not men, they were property. And so even though he was in a free state of Missouri, he technically still was not a man. Now why is that so important? Because when we get done with the Civil War, we have to make a number of amendments, 3 of them in fact, to decide how the slaves are going to go about getting their freedom. All right. Now the next thing is states' rights. Now the states' rights came up and basically said, after the Civil War, that they're going to sit there and basically decide that slaves were for themselves, and so national government permitted these people to happen, and this was a major topic. And there were other states' rights issues outside of slavery, you guys. Everyone wants to say the Civil War was about slavery. It was about states' rights, and the biggest state right was slavery, but there were numerous other ones. And you can see that there were quite a few. Now, the period after the war was called Reconstruction. Now, there were numerous plans that were to be had, but the one that won, in the end, would allow Confederate people, so long as they weren't big, high-ranking Confederate people, to come back into the Union, which is the United States, provided there was this transitionary period, Reconstruction. But the big thing that made the Southern people mad was the fact that they were allowed to put troops in Southern cities. And a lot of people felt really uncomfortable with this, especially quartering of soldiers and things from England, etc. But this is what happened with Reconstruction. And it was a very, very kind of odd time. Now, during the time of Reconstruction, we do have the Civil War amendments I mentioned before, 13, 14, 15. Now, a way to remember this, and it may sound very Wizard of Oz-y, is to set them free, give them rights, let them vote. Oh my. So the 13th Amendment set them free. The Emancipation Proclamation did not free the slaves. I'm going to say it again. The Emancipation Proclamation did not free the slaves. Lincoln does not have that power. Remember we talked about checks and balances, correct? A president can't make a big overarching law like that. It doesn't happen. The legislative branch has to do it. Okay? Now, just because they're free, remember, slaves through Dred Scott were not considered citizens, or men even, for that matter. So the 14th Amendment has to happen. This basically said that, yes, former slaves are now citizens of the United States with all rights and properties provided them. We sometimes call this the second due process. But a big phrase that's going to come back, maybe in the end to hurt them, is the idea of equal protection under the law. Now, what does that even mean? I'll bring it up when we come up to the end of that, but just remember that phrase will come back. Lastly, the biggest vote they were denied later on was the right to vote. So the 15th Amendment gave black males the right to vote. Now, why not women? No women, regardless of their race, was able to vote in the 1800s. That didn't happen until 1919, and we'll get that in progressivism, okay? This is kind of the fruits of labor. What did all these people die in the Civil War over? It was these 3 things. So, now, the first trial we had was something called the Slaughterhouse Case. Just because you make something doesn't mean the federal government's going to back it up. So the Slaughterhouse Cases were out to see, were the federal government, or was the federal government, going to enforce that 14th Amendment? It basically said that these 2 groups of people couldn't stay in the same boarding houses when they were slaughtering cattle. And I know that seems just kind of ridiculous and over the top, but that's what they actually believed. And what they basically came up with was the idea that they could have separate dormitories, if you will, separate little housing, provided that they were given the same treatment. Later on, we're going to call that separate but equal, and this is kind of a big setup for that. Now, some other things we had after the Civil War was somebody called a scallywag. Now, a scallywag, you think of maybe Johnny Depp and the Pirates of the Caribbean, that person's. But as you see there, a scallywag is a Southern dissenter. Now, a dissenter means somebody who completely disagrees with us. So this is someone who lives in the South, but actually helped the North during the Civil War. Maybe a traitor, maybe a backstabber, a snitch, something like that, but that is a scallywag, all right? Now, the other person was called a carpetbagger. Now, these were northern businesses who came to the South following the Civil War, and they brought their carpet bag. Now, why a carpet bag? We didn't have suitcases back then. You kind of just rolled all your belongings up in a carpet and tied it up, hence carpet bag. But these people came down to make money. That was the name of the game, and they came through, and they were shrewd businessmen. They tried to sell you every kind of just useless crap you don't need. But that was the idea of a carpetbagger. Now, Reconstruction comes to an end in 1876. And as you see here, they called it the fraud of the century. We have two men, Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden, running for president. What happens? Tie. So, what happens in the case of a tie of popular vote? Well, popular vote does not determine president, rather electoral college does. So they looked at that, and guess what? Tie. So how do we settle this? How do we figure out who wins? It actually goes to Congress. And the first time through Congress, guess what? Tie. And so how are we going to settle this? How are we going to decide who is our president? There was a backdoor deal made. And this backdoor deal was basically become known as the Compromise of 1877. Samuel Tilden said, I will give you, Rutherford B. Hayes, the presidency, if you get the troops out of the South and in Reconstruction. And so they did. And Hayes became president. He wasn't a very good one. We don't really talk about it much. And Samuel Tilden provided the setup we have right here. And that was the idea that no one was there to protect the former slaves at this point. And we see rise of former Confederate soldiers taking the ranks, and then also the rise of the KKK to basically, quote, scare them back into their place. But those are things we're going to look at the next video. But there you go. Hope that was good.